You've already met my wife, Tasha. One of the best. Tasha is the best leader that I know on earth. She's just genuinely like the best leader that I know. Chris was saying earlier that we started this work in downtown Seattle. In fact, we started on January 8th this year. Last year, we began with a few conversations with a few friends of ours. Something born when we moved to the heart of downtown. But we came to Regen last year, and we saw what you guys were doing over here, and Tasha spoke phenomenally. And we saw what you guys were doing over here, and I thought to myself, it's doable. Like if those guys in Vancouver can do it, we can do it in the heart of Seattle. And so we hustled. We found a guy that owned a clothing store, and we said to him, hey man, we heard there's a bar at the back of your store. Can we meet in that bar and start church in there? And he was like, yeah, you do your thing, man. So we started bringing people into this bar, and there was alcohol everywhere around it. And I said to them, you are welcome to grab yourself a bottle of wine so long as you stay in the service. And so people began staying, and we are seeing something unfold over there that we hope, really, our prayer, our hope is that it will be anything, if it is anything like what you guys have over here, we'll be like, yeah, we've done some good work. Like the Lord has done something good in and through us. So we are excited over that work that we are doing. Our church, as Chris was saying, it's a traditional American megachurch. Like we multi-site all across the suburbs. We've never had an expression downtown, and we are seeing people in the heart of Seattle where the city is just growing in influence. The city is just flourishing, and we know that the more the city flourishes, the more it grows in influence, the more the presence of Jesus is needed. And so our design is to bring the presence of Jesus into that space. All right. All that to say, thank you so much for having us. We are grateful. We are grateful to be in this relationship. I am always grateful to be invited into relationships. And so this one, Chris, we are incredibly grateful. So please thank Pastor Dave and Cheryl for us. We just say thank you so much for having us over here. And one thing I know about you from having met you a couple of times now is that you are one of the most intentional human beings that I know. And for that, I am grateful, sir. Thank you so much for inviting us into relationship. The whole team over here, we are so grateful to be connected with you guys. I am a South African man. Are there any South Africans in this room? Stop! Come here! Where you from? You're from Johannesburg? Yeah. Oh, sweet. Good to see you, man. Okay, I can drop the mic. Go home, Moses. Hey, man, good to see you, bro. You're from Joburg. Egoli. Fun as a Jersey. That's pretty cool. Apparently, there's over 300,000 South Africans that live in Vancouver now. So drive around and you'll find them. Not many of them are brown like you, don't worry. But drive around and you'll find them. It'll be cool. It'll be fun. Hug them, love on them. So I am a South African guy who refuses to give up his South African citizenship nor assume American citizenship. So everywhere I travel, I still use my South African passport with my American green card. All right. So like you cannot leave the green card behind because it's still the ticket that gets me everywhere else. But I love my South African passport, and so I married myself an American lady, and so she becomes the original African American, as it were, right? So she becomes that, and so we are having fun. We are living it out. No kids yet, but that means that in the absence of physical kids, biological kids, we are giving birth to churches, which is a weird thing that's happening right now, but it's beautiful. It's kind of beautiful. It's like Paul saying to people, don't get married so that you can start churches. We're like, don't have kids so that you can start churches, and we are loving it. The book of Luke is my favorite book in the scriptures. It is my absolute favorite book. And the reason the book of Luke is my favorite book, of all the 4 synoptic gospels that were written, we know that John writes of his endeavors, of his interactions with Jesus and having walked with him. And we know that when John writes his text, it's one of the most intellectual texts that he has. And in fact, he writes it in some ways to refute the Greeks who speak of this notion that ideas hold the universe together. And he refutes that by saying to us that Jesus is the ultimate idea that holds the universe together. And we know Mark, when he writes, he looks at the Roman Empire and he says it is the most powerful empire that only knows nothing but sword and destruction wherever it goes. Even as they're building all across the universe, really what they're doing is they do so through sword. And he writes back to them in the most violent way by telling us that God is a powerful God. And even when he comes to the earth, he will be an indestructible God. And Matthew traces the lineage of Jesus back, and he shows us of Jesus' Jewish heritage. And he says to us, really, he is the one that you will find as a seed of Abraham ultimately. And so he traces him back to his earthly heritage, and he gives him to us on a silver platter. And he says, he who has an earthly heritage is the one who has now come to be with us. But breaks ranks with all of that story. Luke breaks rank in part because he never met Jesus. He never encountered Jesus. What he knows of Jesus is what they who walked with Jesus tell him about Jesus. In particular, the Apostle Paul, a man who went around all of Asia Minor just building the church up, who came to, from a mystical experience, know Jesus more intimately than anyone that ever did, as far as we know. And so he tells Luke of who this Jesus is, and he says to Luke, go meet the others that encountered Jesus and find out about him and ask who he is. And so Luke, being a curious man that he was, goes and visits the friends who used to walk with Jesus and asks them about him. And someone, I don't know who, but one of them, said to Luke that a story is told of how one day Jesus walked into an environment such as this, what they called a temple then. And he walked into this environment having been a qualified rabbi at the time. And it was his turn to open the scrolls. It was his turn to open the book that we are about to read from in a moment. And on that particular day, the passage that he so happened to read from, Luke writes as Luke chapter 4, quoting out of the book of Isaiah, an old prophet found in ancient Israel. And so when Jesus reads this, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Knowing then and believing at the time that there is only one God. A sense of plurality had not entered the human imagination as we know it right now. And so he says, there's only one God. And Jesus walks into this room and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Reading from the scrolls, and he says, this Spirit has anointed him to set those who are captive at liberty. And he says the Spirit is upon him to announce that those who cannot see, both in a physical sense and a spiritual sense, those who cannot see will now have sight. And Luke adds that even those who are oppressed by the injustices of this world will find freedom. And then he concludes the thoughts by saying he has come to announce the year of the Lord's favor. This idea that there's a posture that God assumes. There's a posture that God stands in. There's a way that he faces humanity. There's a way that he faces all earthly concerns. And he says the posture that God assumes is a posture of compassion. He has come to announce the year of the Lord's favor. I am intrigued by Luke. I am interested by this Gentile doctor. I am interested in this man who so curiously broke down who Jesus was. And so through the lens of Luke, we see how people who would otherwise not be included in the story of Jesus are invited in. All of a sudden, the voices of women are being echoed. All of a sudden, the voices of children are brought forth and said, we can listen to you now. And all of a sudden, the voices of outsiders are invited into the space. Come in, you're welcome. Because Jesus' great proclamation is that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him, Jesus, to do a work and show the posture of God towards humanity. And so when Jesus closed the scroll that day, he said on the day that he read that passage, it had then been fulfilled. And Luke goes on to tell more stories of what that looked like. And one of them, curiously, is found in Luke chapter 15. Where Luke says that Jesus was standing in front of a crowd such as this, and he was telling stories of who God was. And as he was telling these stories, he is very specific to say to us that there were religious leaders in that environment. There were people well versed with the law. There were people who knew morality from immorality. There were people whose social standing dictated that they could not be in an environment like that. And so these people marveled when they saw this here Jesus talking to every single person that was in front of him. And in fact, Luke becomes very specific, and he says there were people who were tax collectors in that environment. And in this era of the Roman Empire, tax collectors were fairly despised people, really resented people. Because they would look at the vulnerable and the marginalized, and they will double tax them more than everyone else. And so the pious religious leaders somehow sanctimoniously looked upon these people and said, "Why are you doing that?" while they themselves were abusing the people in a like manner. And so they call Jesus out. They say, "You are hanging out with tax collectors. You are hanging out with people they classified as sinners," which really is just another word for undesirables, which really is just another phrase for saying people who do things that make us uncomfortable. And so they call Jesus out and they say, "Why are you hanging out to these people? Why are you talking with these people?" And Jesus, hearing their mumblings and rumblings, responds by telling stories. I grew up in an African household. How many Africans in this room? Now you know that storytelling is steeped in our tradition. That's the thing. One of my favorite South African authors is the guy who died at the age of 25 and wrote one of the most significant books I've ever encountered in my life. And one of the lines in his book is this idea. He says, Eurocentric people, i.e. white people. He says, Eurocentric people. He says, Eurocentric people, when writing stories or when engaging in conversations, they do so with an outcome in mind. But he says Africans tell stories for the sake of telling stories. We sit at the table for the sake of sitting at the table. We have conversation for the sake of having conversation because that's how connectedness is attained. My dad was a storyteller. My father was a phenomenal storyteller, a great man, especially if he had drank. Then my brother and I would have to sit and listen to these stories over and over again. And eventually you're like, "Man, you've told way too many stories for us to even know what you're talking about." So it's curious for me that when Jesus, this accusation is leveled at him, he responds not directly to the questions asked, but what he does is tell stories. And he tells 3 stories. The charge to him is, if you so claim to be who you are, why is it that the social outcasts are listening to you right now and you're listening to them? If you so claim to be who you are, how is it that the tax collectors and the sinners and the prostitutes of the world are sitting at your table? And Jesus begins with the first story. He says there was a shepherd who once took his sheep out to pasture. And in the midst of this journey, the shepherd looked around and he counted and realized there's only 99 around him. And he freaked out a little bit. And something in his heart so broke that he realized he needed to go find the one that was now missing. And he says the shepherd went in the direction that he figured the sheep had gone, and he found it. And when he found it, the shepherd carried that thing on his shoulders, and he bounced up and down back to the rest of the fold. And eventually when he got back home, he called his neighbors and said, "Neighbor, I'm going to tell you a story that you know nothing about." But the story is that while I was out taking my sheep out to pasture, one of them ran away. But I went out of my way to find the sheep and I brought it home. And Jesus looked at his accusers and he said to them, God has come to find the lost. And I imagine that Jesus looks into their eyes and he recognizes that it has not landed that which he's telling them. So he goes on and tells them a second story and he says, there's a lady who once lost a coin under her bed. Have you ever lost a coin in your house? I lose things. I lose key fobs. To this day at work, they refuse to give me a key fob. Because you lose key fobs for fun, bruh. My favorite thing to lose, though, is the remote control. Trying to Netflix, And so I lose stuff, and my anxiety just goes up anytime I lose stuff. And I start blaming myself, and I start thinking to myself, man, what's wrong with you? And then the second stage of anxiety is me going like, God, why are you not helping me find this remote control? And then ultimately I go to my wife, I'm like, Tasha, what's wrong with you? Where's the remote control? I'm better than Adam, right? The first thing he did was blame his wife. I'm like, my wife is third on the list. She's not number one. Right? So, and then I realized the remote control is under my bun. Big bun, go to gym. So it's like, so Jesus says this woman loses a coin and has a similar type of anxiety. And she frets about it, and then she goes out of her way to look for this coin, and she just turns everything upside down. And eventually she finds the coin. It's a valuable coin, it turns out. Because you know what she does next? Neighbor! I got a story to tell you that you know nothing about. I found my missing coin. And Jesus says, God is looking out for the lost things. And he looks into their eyes and he realizes they don't get it. 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 And so he humanizes the story for them. Says there was a dad, a well-off dad. He was okay. 2 sons. And he'd done all right for himself to the extent where he could leave something for his kids. And this dad one day had one of his sons come to him, and the kid says, "Hey, Pa, what's up?" And the father's like, "Hey, son." And the dude says to his dad, "Look, man, I know you've worked your hindsight off for very many years to make sure that my brother and I have everything that we need." And he says to him, "Do you mind giving me my inheritance right now so that I can go make a living for myself?" In other words, Dad, I don't think I need you right now. In fact, I am okay with you being dead to me. So give me what's mine so that I can go do what I need to do with my life. And Jesus, capturing the tension, says the dad was so heartbroken in this very instance that he gathered all the possessions that he had. And he divided them between the 2 sons, and he gave the younger one what he wanted and held it for the older one who decided to stay at home. And the younger one took what he had and he ran off with it. And then Luke says he partied out there. He did all sorts of things with it. It wasn't until the older brother gets into the conversation that we realize that part of what he did with the money was anytime he would go into the cities, he would see these young ladies who were cheapening themselves and their value, and he would place monetary value on that. He would purchase them for a night of fun. That his friends would come around, and his friends realized that he had a lot of cash on him, and so they would be like, "Yo, dude, because you are making it rain, we're going to be friends with you." And then the hotel managers loved him because he spent more than anyone else. People loved him, were cool with him. And Luke says, as Jesus tells the story, he adds a little tidbit that the economy tanked. The economy of the city that the kid was in, but also his own personal economy. The funds ran dry. So when the funds ran dry, he realized that all of a sudden people are deserting him. Girls ain't responding to him no more because he was buying them. Friends ain't high-fiving him no more because they were in his life while he was cool. Now he's not cool anymore. No one's liking his Instagram posts no more because his reputation is tarnished. And so the kid, when he's running dry, at this point, really, he's become a man, hasn't he? Goes back to the hotel manager, says to the hotel manager, hey, could you hook me up with a job? And the guy says, yeah, man, I can hook you up with a job. I got pigs that need cleaning up. Mind feeding them and cleaning them? And Jesus says that his mind became so debased that at one point he was very tempted to eat with the pigs. Same food that they ate. And a thought occurred to him. And the thought was, my dad has servants who live better than me. The kid said, I could go back to my dad and I'll just ask him if I can be a servant in his house. And so he makes a trek back home. And as he's walking back home, far off, he sees a man standing at the gate. And unbeknownst to him, his dad had been showing up every single day, standing at that gate, looking out to the horizon, wondering when his son would come home. So on this occasion, the man sees the kid walking towards the house. And he runs towards him. And I imagine that the kid's heart is beating very fast, because he doesn't know what's going to happen to him. The dad runs, and so he begins running towards the dad as well. And when he gets to him, he falls to his feet. And he says, Dad, I've messed up. And the father picks him up and he says, get up, son, I'm happy you're home. And the kid said, I've done nothing to deserve coming back home, and I'm here. And the dad hugs him, clutches him, holds him, and looks back, and he calls out to one of his servants, and he says, yo, the best leather jacket you can find in my drawer. The very best one, bring it. Because the kid stank. He'd been hanging out with pigs. And the father said, the very best clothes you can find in my drawer, bring them right now while we're standing at this gate. Says, unclothe him of all these rags and put the best on him. Then he called out to another servant and said, hey, find the best cattle we have. We're going to make a feast tonight. Then he calls out to a third category of people. Friends, neighbors, I know you know that my son declared me dirt, but I got good news for you. My son's back home. My son's back home. And Jesus stares back at these men, religious rulers and leaders, men who knew stuff, highly educated people. And he looks at them and he adds an addendum to the story. And he says there was an older brother, you remember, when we started the story, who had been home, and he got a little uncomfortable when he realized the party we were about to throw for his brother. And he said, yo, dude, I've been here forever. Why aren't you throwing no party for me? Why aren't you inviting the neighbors to come and hang? Why aren't you giving me that leather jacket because I've been eyeing it? The dad said, kiddo, you've been here. Everything that's mine has been yours. But this, your brother, was dead. But now, he's alive. And I imagine Jesus looks at these men who are hurling accusations at him. And he's reminded of when he opened the scroll and he read that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him. That the Spirit of the Lord has anointed him to do what he just described the stories do. That lost people now find life when they encounter who Jesus is. That people who thought they could go out there and live fanciful lives and drive fanciful cars and hide their insecurities behind the glitz and glamour, in truth can only find true life in Jesus. And I imagine that he's holding up a mirror back at these scholars of the law. And the mirror is, you think you have found life in your moralism. You think you have found life in your do's and don'ts. You think you have found life in your social status. But reality is, life is found at the feet of Jesus, where prostitutes are sitting. At the feet of Jesus, where thieves are sitting. At the feet of Jesus, where cheaters are sitting. At the feet of Jesus, where business people are sitting. At the feet of Jesus, where philosophers are sitting. And so when Socrates asked us, what is a good life? Jesus would respond by telling 3 stories. There was a sheep that wandered about. There was a coin that fell out of a pocket. And there was a kid who ran away from home. And Jesus would tell us that life is that God has been pursuing the lost to bring them back to life again. Something about it, though. But when life comes like that, the systems of this world will oppose it. And there's something about it, though, that when personal piety becomes an appeal for you, the systems of the world will oppose it. For when Jesus reads the scroll, instantly people became uncomfortable. And when he invites the nobodies to come and hang out with him, everyone around him also became uncomfortable. Because there's a thing about a guy who gives up his pornography addiction, that somebody in Toronto stands to lose some dollars as a result of that. And there's something that happens when you give up your addiction to alcohol, that some liquor store stands to lose its profits from that. There's something about it that when you give up your material consumption, that some clothing store out of Spain will become uncomfortable with that. Some credit recording company that is invested in you being bound in the things that you're bound to, it's going to be uncomfortable. And there's something about it that when we stand up for the goodwill of others, the common good, and we shout at the top of our lungs that justice belongs to all of humanity, that really we aren't shouting for equality, but we are crying for equity of opportunity, that others will be uncomfortable when that banner is lifted. And Jesus instantly challenges those 2 systems, the ones that are affront to your personal piety, but the ones that are also from a systemic position invested in putting down others. He says the Spirit of the Lord is upon him to liberate the ones who are oppressed. The Spirit of the Lord is upon him to set at liberty the captives. The Spirit of the Lord is upon him to open the eyes of those who don't see. Spiritual sight, the feature that God has created for you. And Luke says, this is how we came to encounter Jesus. This is how we came to know him. And Paul the mystic, he writes to his youngling, the kid that he was mentoring. He writes to Timothy at the very end of his life. And in parentheses, let me add over here. Young people, friends, it's important to have older people around us who will share the wisdom of their journey with us. And we will learn from their mistakes and we will learn from their successes. It's imperative that we walk with those people. And so Paul had a young man named Timothy that he had left his church that he had planted in Ephesus with. And this kid, in many ways, Paul described as having been a weakling, although an educated individual who had grown and learned. There was something about him that made him frail a little bit. He was a nervous person. And so the very last letter that the Apostle Paul writes is to this young person named Timothy, 2 Timothy. The letter that the Apostle Paul writes to him is really a charge of faith. And one of the things that he writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1 from verses 6 to 10, the writing is as follows, and let me read it for us. Because he says, Timothy, I am writing to encourage you to fan into a flame and rekindle the fire of the spiritual gift God imparted to you when I laid hands on you. For God will never give you the spirit of fear, but the Holy Spirit who gives you mighty power, love, and self-control. So never be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor be embarrassed over my imprisonment, Paul at this time in prison, but overcome every evil by the revelation of the power of God. There's a heritage that exists, Paul says to Timothy. There's a heritage that exists. And many of you walked into this room here tonight because you have been having phenomenal series over these past weeks. But what you don't know is that historically there have been people walking this land, pointing people to Jesus. What you don't know is that there's an atmosphere in this place that has been ruled by darkness for a long time. And there have been people that have been opposing it. And it is in that heritage that we now step in. What used to be their faith can now become our faith. What used to be them piercing the darkness with light can now be us piercing the darkness with light. And Paul says to Timothy, you received this when I, as an elder, imparted it into you. And what in fact was given to you was the mighty power of God that enables you now to walk in that strength that God has granted you. That you can now walk in love, this notion that you are interested in the well-being of others over and above your own, because as you are interested in the well-being of others, you will see that they will take care of you. And he concludes it by saying, even your personal piety, you will have self-control. And those small acts of you having self-control, you will ultimately bring down destructive forces around you. He says, fan the flame, and he says he gave us resurrection of life, he Jesus, and drew us to himself by his holy calling on our lives. And it wasn't because of any good we have done. Remember the kid who went back home and knelt at his dad's feet. And he says, Dad, I've done nothing to deserve what you're about to give me. And the dad said, hey, you're home, that's all that matters. But by his divine pleasure and marvelous grace, and that confirmed our union with the anointed Jesus even before time began, this truth is now being unveiled by the revelation of the anointed Jesus. Listen to this. Our life giver, who has dismantled death, obliterating all its effects on our lives, and has manifested immortal life in us by the gospel. Ladies and gentlemen, here's my concluding thought to you. Within every single heart sitting in this room, there's immortality. A desire for immortality. This is why Musk is trying to take us to Mars. Because humanity now knows we want to live forever. It's been the design forever. And Paul says to us, it was when Jesus came to the earth that human beings could connect in real terms with that immortality. And so we who were far, we who were leading destructive lives, we who were violators, we who were violated, we who found our identity in that violation. He says, we who lived under the dark cloud are now being invited into resurrected life. And that looks like Jesus. And he says this to Timothy. He says this. But you've got to fan the flame. You've got to fan the flame of resurrected life. In other words, it's not someone else's faith. It's not my girlfriend's faith. She may have brought me to church tonight, but it's not her faith. It's my faith. And it's not my mom's faith. I know she used to pray for me. I remember we used to go to church with me, but it's not my faith. It's not my relationship. It's not my life-giving sustenance. And where I thought I will find life out there, I know I will find life in here so that I can impact out there. So now I know that I'm straddling this line on this side of eternity. The point is I get to sit at the feet of Jesus with my eyes fixed on the long term. A life with him is a life of flourishing. The older brother in the story of Jesus, when he tells of these two brothers, didn't understand that God's grace was as sufficient for him having stayed at home as it was for the brother who had left. The one who fights social justice or injustice ought to realize that the ones that are not outraged for the injustice inflicted on others are blind to that reality. But the ones that are outraged are short-sighted. Because really, it is at the feet of Jesus where we all get invited. The great equalizer. The PhD, the master's level, the undergrad, the high school graduate, the middle school dropout, the impoverished, the marginalized, the silenced voices, strong towers of society at the same table. The story of Jesus dismantles the systems of this world as we know them. Not only does it obliterate them, but it brings to life the souls from whom life has been sucked as a result. And now when we go and purchase things, when we go and enjoy things, when we go and engage in conversation, we know that these things don't have us. We sat at the feet of Jesus. And Paul says, fan the flame. Fan the flame. Because the Spirit of the Lord has anointed Jesus to liberate me, who was a captive. And I don't know what you were captive to. I don't know what it is when you get home tonight in your bedroom when no one sees you. I don't know what's happening on your computer screen. I don't know what's happening in your mind. I don't know. Maybe you spend 9 hours, 10 hours a day and you are performing your way to stuff. Maybe your whole life is a performance. And then when you get home, you're so exhausted you just break down. Because the tension that you hold on your shoulders, you can no longer bear. And waking up is a difficult exercise. And when that alarm goes off in the morning, you have to get up. And the struggle is real for you. Maybe your relationships are falling apart. Because people have unmasked you. They've seen you for what you truly are, and because they really were not on your side. They're not walking away from you and say, hey man, I don't want nothing to do with the struggle in life. Maybe you are succeeding. Maybe you are making it. But in all honesty, all it is just striving to prove yourself over and over again. And tonight, all I came to say to you is at the feet of Jesus, there's this invitation for a life-giving conversation. And when that happens, a lifelong standing for you would be, hey, will you fan the flame of resurrected life? Will you fan the flame of immortality? Will you walk this invited life? Friends, I'm not in your heart. I'm not in your households. I'm not in your relationships. I'm not in your phone conversations. I'm not in any of the things that you are writing in the book that no one has access to. But I know the systems of the world. And I know their design. And I know that we could live in the most flourishing city and still be bound. I know we could be frustrated with things happening elsewhere and not know how to liberate people. And in some ways, I think this is what's happening to the religious leaders and the lawyers that are interacting with Jesus. And in some ways, I think he's inviting them to say, hey, can you sit? 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 So tonight, I invite you to look within your own heart. I invite you to consider the dead things. And have you wonder if you could bring them to the feet of the one on whom the anointing of the Lord sits. For your sake. For your sake. For your sake. Will you bow your heads with me and close your eyes, please? When they asked Jesus, how is it that you are sitting with tax collectors and sinners? They're really asking him, what type of God are you? What type of deity are you? And really in the stories, his response is the type that has come to bring value back to the ones who lost that value in themselves. And they're cheapening themselves. So, sir, ma'am, before you go back to that casual sex relationship where you cheapen yourself, before you go back into that conversation where somehow you've subjected yourself to the person who's emotionally abusing you, before you go back to that striving, trying to prove yourself, not operating in the rhythm of your own grace, or his grace. So, before you go back to your computer screen, your fantastical life, ma'am, before you go back to cutting, there's an invitation to resurrection life. And his name is Jesus. You might say to me, hey man, I go to church, I show up at church. That's not what I'm inviting you to. The invitation is to resurrected life. And his name is Jesus. And I ask that you let him work on the wounds in your heart. And I ask that you let him heal the broken heart. And I ask that you let him inspire devotion to causes that are much bigger than you. I ask that you place him at the center and watch as everything else pales in comparison. And the Apostle Paul says we do so simply by believing in our hearts. And tonight you might say, man, I don't know. You don't know what I did last night, bro. It was Tuesday night, but you don't know what I did last night. Well, tax collectors, prostitutes, sinners, crime ringleaders sat at his feet. The professors too. He hung out with them. He shifted their perspective of what immortality looked like. And he personalizes it for every single one of us in this room tonight. So with eyes closed, just respecting the moment as you're considering your own station in life, may I ask you to respond to the invitation to resurrection life. May I ask you to hand over the hidden things to Jesus. The places in your life that are dead. The things in you that are lost. May I ask you to hand them over to Jesus right now. So if that's you tonight and you say, hey, I want to give my life to Jesus, Paul says all you got to do is believe. And having believed, all you got to do is just confess that Jesus is Lord. And Paul writes to the church in Colossae, a city very similar to Vancouver, port city, hub at the time of writing of economic activity in Asia. And he says to them, I know you think your economy is the center. I know you think your people groups are the center, but really what is the center of the universe is Jesus. He brings everything together. So if that's you tonight and you're responding, and somehow something I said tonight had resonance with you, and you're saying tonight, I give my life fully to Jesus. And it's a rational decision, although born of some degree of emotion, but it's a rational decision where you no longer prove yourself, but you're surrendering to the center of the universe with eyes closed and head bowed so as to not to embarrass anybody in the room. But if you're making that consideration, will you make an acknowledgement to yourself and just raise your hand in this room and just say, hey man, that's me. I want to give my life to Jesus. If you want to give your life to Jesus, well, just raise your hand right now. Just raise it. Just raise it high. Just raise it high. Just raise it high. Just raise it high. Keep it high once you've raised it. Keep it high once you've raised it. Come on, you just raise it high. Just raise it high. Thank you. Thank you. Keep raising it. Thank you. Thank you. Keep raising it. Keep raising it, church. Thank you. 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 Father, I pray for these people who have raised their hands, God. And I pray for the ones who are making this decision right now to yield to who you are. And my prayer, God, is that you will bring resurrection life to our reality. I pray, God, that you will embrace them as a father embraced the son who had run away, and that you just hug them, that you just love them. And I pray that you do so through people who will love on them, God, that will come alongside them and just love them. And I pray, Lord God, that you will come to them through people who would want to know them and who would tell them that they are needed. God, I pray that you will return value to them. Pray that you will return hope to them. Thank you for the gift of salvation, Father, tonight. That you begin a work in people's lives that you alone will complete. God, we thank you for Jesus. That we can sit at his feet tonight and fan the flame of our faith. Amen.